Thank you, Lascian Corla. Minister, yesterday's economic statement is an opportunity for us all to have a conversation about the country we want to live in and the country we want our children to grow up in. Should we focus on becoming a lower tax economy, or should we invest in enterprise, in public services like health and education, and in communities? My view is we should do the latter. The economy is growing again and unemployment is falling, and that is great news for everybody. But in their dull speeches yesterday, government ministers went out of their way to convince us that this good news is their doing. And it isn't. Well, some of it is, but most of it isn't. Had the right choices been made over the last 4 years, we would have got to this good news a lot earlier than we did. And the Minister Noonan spoke yesterday about the lost decade, meaning that it will be about 10 years for us to get our economy back to the level it was in 2007. Now, the phrase the lost decade comes from Mexico in the 1980s, which went through a crisis and which took a decade to recover. Now, you've got to think, if it's taking Ireland the same amount of time to recover as it took Mexico 30 years ago, this government hasn't done a very good job. The economic and job growth comes mainly from two sources, from the ECB and from the resilience of Irish enterprise and Irish people. When Mario Draghi took over presidency of the European Union from Jean-Claude Trichet, he changed tack on monetary policy. Where Trichet demanded austerity, Draghi believed in using monetary policy to boost growth. In 2012, he said that the ECB would do whatever it takes. It became a famous phrase, whatever it takes to preserve the euro. Now, this increased confidence in the currency, and it drove down borrowing costs for Ireland and for other Eurozone countries. He followed this with quantitative easing, which in essence means the ECB is printing vast amounts of money, about 60 billion a month, and lending it to Eurozone banks at zero interest rates. So what's the result of this? Mortgage rates fall, businesses can borrow and invest, the euro depreciates, increasing tourism and the competitiveness of Irish exports. It's interesting to note that the euro has depreciated by nearly 30% against the US dollar in the last year. That's a 30% increase in competitiveness, which is very, very welcome, but has absolutely nothing to do with this government. What are the resilience of the Irish people? The latest ESRI economic statement forecasts or estimates that about 60% of the economic growth is coming from increased labour productivity. Now, that means that public sector workers and private sector workers are having to do more with less, and they are succeeding. Again, nothing to do with government policy. Now, to be fair, the government has policies that have worked and have added to employment. But even here, the government is found wanting. Again, the ESRI has done analysis on job activation measures and finds that Ireland's job activation measures are the weakest in the Eurozone. Now, that's a pretty damning indictment of government policy from our own independent economic think tank. Far more should have been done. Far more could have been done. The mortgage crisis is in its 7th year. It has become the biggest of its kind anywhere in the world, and it could have been sorted out years ago. It has acted and continues to act as a massive drag on economic growth and job creation, and obviously has caused an awful lot of social harm and distress. Supports for SMEs and the self-employed could have been much stronger, like improving how local authorities calculate rates, taking other things into account other than the space of the business. And tax treatment for the self-employed should have been equalised with PAYE workers long ago. Public works should have been pushed sooner, like the broadband strategy. Childcare costs could have been reduced at zero cost to the Exchequer. I've been proposing that for several years. And budgets could have been and should have been progressive rather than regressive. We've now seen 4 regressive budgets in a row. And the last budget was the worst. In the first 3 budgets, everybody lost. But the less money you had to begin with, the more you lost. In the last budget, there was a transfer of wealth from the lower half of the income group to the upper half of the income group. So not only is this government implementing regressive budgetary policy, it's actually accelerating the regressivity of that. Now, the evidence on this is unambiguous. We all want growth and we all want jobs. Now, the evidence on this is clear. Policies that drive up inequality are bad for economic growth and they're bad for job creation. And in my opinion, they're just plain wrong. So, what's needed? There's a big push from the government, we heard it yesterday, to reduce taxes. reduce income taxes, reduce wealth taxes. Now, this philosophy, which has been implemented consistently over the last 4 years, is the following. Economic growth lies with the wealthy. They are the rainmakers, they are the masters of the universe. And so if we're going to boost the economy and we're going to boost jobs, we must increase the wealth of the wealthy. This is Thatcher economics, it's Reagan economics. It didn't work in the past, it doesn't work now, and yet for some reason it is being pursued by this government during a recession. Now, even the billionaires don't agree with this anymore. Last year, Davos, the world's billionaires club, identified inequality and climate change as the two biggest threats to society globally. That's coming from the billionaires. And yet, the argument in Ireland is return wealth to the wealthy and everybody will gain. Ireland is already a low-tax economy. Some taxes do need to be altered. For example, there should be equalisation between the self-employed and PAYE workers. I don't know why it still exists. It shouldn't exist. My understanding is it comes from times past where self-employed people did have numerous ways of lowering their tax exposure that PAYE workers don't have and didn't have, and that's gone. But even in the last budget, taxation measures came through that applied higher rates of income tax to self-employed people. A reduction in wealth tax is not required. It's very important that we understand what's going on. I talked at the start about ECB monetary policy. Quantitative easing is going to cause a significant asset bubble. It's what it does. It's what it does wherever a central bank prints lots and lots of money and gives it to banks. What happens? There's loads of money out there. People get that money and want to buy stuff with it, and the price of that stuff goes up. We get an asset price bubble. Who owns the assets? The wealthy. So by doing nothing, the owners of capital in Europe are about to gain very, very significantly from ECB policy. And therefore the argument that says, well, we should reduce CGT as well is unnecessary. Their wealth due to government policy is going to increase, and it's going to increase substantially. And it's going to increase for a very, very small number of people in financial services, the owners of the capital and the people who facilitate those transactions. So what should we do instead? I believe we should keep taxes more or less where they are. Ireland is a low-tax economy. We are significantly lower than the Eurozone average, and we should stay lower than the Eurozone average. We have some competitive disadvantages, like being on an island, and so transport costs are more expensive. And so we have to have some competitive advantages. Having a lower taxation rate than the Eurozone average does make sense. But going lower again doesn't make sense. So what should we do? We should invest. We should invest in enterprise. We should invest in public services, particularly in education, which has basically been asset stripped over the last number of years. And we should reinvest in community supports. I was at a fantastic youth outreach programme in Bray on Monday, and it turns out that over the last 4 years, their funding has dropped by 31%. It's got to stop. That kind of investment from the state has got to be some of the most important and beneficial investment that a state can spend. And their spend has been brought back by 31%. So I say, don't reduce CGT. The wealthy are going to get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier anyway. Reinvest the money in youth outreach, reinvest it in community-based care, reinvest it in the third-level colleges, in the DESH schools. That's what we need to start doing. We need to start investing in the future. I don't believe people mind paying their taxes if they know that those taxes are respected, are spent well, are invested in them, are invested in their children, are invested in their communities, and are invested in their country. So I think it's a very timely debate to have now. We are at an inflection point. The entire country has come through a very, very difficult time. And the question is, where do we all want to go? We are a low-tax economy. Let's keep a competitive advantage on tax, but for goodness sake, let's start investing in the future as well. If we're going to compete internationally in the next 10 years, we have to get our house in order. That means bringing everyone out of the lost decade and making sure that we don't lose any more. Thank you.